Hello, everyone. So glad that you all could make it. I guess there are still a few people arriving, so I hope they don't miss too much of this message, but we want to start punctually. Welcome from the Berlin School of Creative Leadership. My name is Rose Merrill. I'm the content strategist, and I'll be your host tonight. So if you have any questions to me or technical concerns, you could direct message me and I'll try to deal with them. I also just want to add a personal note to our Berliners. I'm so excited to see so many names of Berliners because I haven't met any of you yet. And I really hope we can meet soon. So welcome to you. And yeah, this is so exciting. It's our first webinar and with Professor David Slocum, as you know. So I have a few technical notes to start off with. You can post any questions as they arise for David in the chat window. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look through those during the lecture, and we're going to figure out what are common concerns and questions. And then we're going to touch on those first during the question and answer period. So the other thing you should know is that your microphones are, of course, muted. We'd like them to stay that way so we can get a good recording, as this will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel and sent to you as well, so you can watch it again. And I think that's all you need to know for now on the technical side. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce, again, for those of you who don't know him, Professor David Slocum. He is the academic advisor to our executive MBA program, and he is the long-standing professor of creative leadership. So let me hand the mic over to him.
Thank you very much, Rose, and very much appreciate everyone taking time out. It's a pleasure as well to see so many familiar faces, smiling faces, and especially during these days, however small your faces are on my screen, your faces are appearing without masks, so that makes me smile. But it's good to be back at the Berlin School. As Rose mentioned, I have a bit of a new title. To be honest, when I decided to return, had conversations with Karsten Rossner, the new CEO, we realized that times were different, and returning to a directorship, in fact, having an academic director at this point was perhaps not appropriate. Didn't fit with some of my own priorities, but also I think the need for change and adaptation and flexibility at the school really requires a different kind of structure. And so that's a structure that I'm happy to contribute to in whatever way I can as an advisor, in a professorial role as well. But it's also a role that I see going forward, and won't talk about that so much today, but next Tuesday, we're going to have a session, a future talk, as we're calling it, where I'll discuss, hopefully with many of you and others in the community, some of my thinking, some of my plans, and also very much interactively to hear about what your priorities are. So I see myself as a kind of an interlocutor for the community and helping to shape and transform the school for the future. All that being said, great content related to creative leadership still seems to me needing to be at the heart of the Berlin School of Creative Leadership. And so part of what we've decided to do is to offer a series of different webinars, as I think was announced, and I'll say much more about in a few minutes. This is the first of 6 webinars on what I'm calling the Practice of Creative Leadership 2021. And it's not necessarily meant to be all-inclusive. In fact, it's an exploratory work in progress. But I think it hopefully will pick up on a number of my current concerns and interests that I look forward to hearing your thoughts about, and also that I very much wish will be of practical value to people, to all of us as leaders who are coping with, I don't know if it will ever be the new normal, but some sort of next normal, or simply wherever we are, where great creative leadership is needed. So that will be one series. I'll talk about another series at the end that my friend and colleagues, some of the, let us say, more experienced, older alums and participants who may be here will remember my predecessor actually is the academic director of the Berlin School, Professor Doug Guthrie, who has for the last 5 years been the head of Apple University in China. He's now back in the US. He and I are working on some projects together, and he's going to do a 6-part limited webinar series starting in 2 weeks on doing business in China. So I think that will be of interest to many, both in terms of China specifics, but also doing business across borders more generally. So this is the sort of content that we want to layer on to the Berlin School EMBA experience, and obviously also to provide as free continuing content for alums and the wider global creative leadership community. I'll say a bit more about the other things that I've been doing along the way, because in fact they bear on the question of the practice of creative leadership, and more specifically, as I'll discuss today, the question of leadership as a craft. But for now, I guess I should just say 2 other things. One is that this will be a particularly dense lecture, in part because I want to preface the entire series on practice before getting to some issues of craft. And I want to do that in about 40 minutes. And this will be the general format, where 35, 40, maybe 45 minutes if we're pushing it, if I'm pushing it. And after that, as Rose indicated, the questions that you have along the way, questions that you have at the end, comments, objections, criticisms, whatever your reactions are, I look forward to fielding those. And we'll have 15 or 20 minutes to do that. The other thing I'll just mention is, in the spirit of the Zoom present that we're in, since it is 2021, I will just mention that I am back in the U.S. currently, although I've chosen what I thought was a suitable background, which is I'm coming to you from the cloud, wherever you are, which I think again is an experience that we're all growing used to in terms of Zoom. But however much we may lament that or wish it were otherwise, at least it gives us this opportunity to meet with each other and talk and learn with each other. So I'm certainly grateful for that. So as I say, the topic of this webinar series is what I'm calling the practice of creative leadership. And this first session is going to be on the matter of craft, which I'll get into in a good deal of more detail. Getting started with this, there's the question of why practice? And for me, there are three or four starting points for my own exploration of practice. And I should say, in going through today's presentation and even through subsequent sessions in the series, I want to avoid, at least initially, dwelling too much on trying to find a kind of magical definition of practice or a single model related to practice, because I've come to the realization after these years, and many of you, especially alums who have done your own great research on your theses or done very thoughtful work throughout the EMBA residencies, we don't need another leadership model. And in fact, I have become fairly critical, you can call me jaded or even cynical, about what people like Barbara Kellerman from the Harvard Kennedy School call the leadership industry. That many of the leadership models that are trotted out regularly, even if you're a devoted reader of, say, the Harvard Business Review, of Fast Company, of Entrepreneur, and so forth, there are new and themselves innovative leadership models which are trumpeted, that seem to offer a kind of skeleton key or a magical solution, a special formula for how to lead today. While there are many insights that we might take from these models, certainly many of the models are based on excellent research. I think that one of the challenges is as we've talked about for years at the Berlin School, that it's unclear what we can take from these models, which are oftentimes assembled from insights or experiences in the past, what we can take from those models to apply to our own present and future challenges. So what is it, these static models, and many of them are very much fixed in terms, for example, of analyzing an organizational structure, a team formation. What can we take from those to address our challenges, moving forward? And so this is not meant, this discussion of practice or today craft, to be the basis of the founding of another leadership model. But obviously we need guideposts, we need signposts, we need markers for how it is that we are going to lead. And much of this comes from our own experience. I'm seeing, for instance, very, very happily and proudly that Luis Miguel is with us, and thinking of the extraordinary experience that he is just one example among many in this room and at the Berlin School has brought to literally years and decades of very successful and fulfilling creative leadership experience at Alma. And I think that that's the sort of approach that turning to practice can suggest to us, that by being better students and learners from our own experience, that we can, in fact, not develop our own model of creative leadership, but again, as I'll talk about, develop a kind of ongoing habit or routine of leadership, a practice, which in fact allows us to perform better. COVID-19, I won't say a lot about, except to say that for all of us, this has both been a disruptor and accelerator, and it has really emphasized, at least for me, in terms of leadership, the need for us to be able to work very quickly on our feet, to draw from our own experiences, and not to rely on static models of the past. And so again, what I want to explore in terms of practice and craft, I believe addresses some of those kind of urgent and fast changing needs. I'm also struck, it was really 2 years ago that I stepped down from the directorship at the Berlin School, and thinking a lot about creative leadership, and in particular talking to one of your predecessors from class 2, Craig Marcus, whom some of you may know, who I've actually been working with, a friend and colleague. He's convinced, and I share some of this concern with him, that creative leadership in the last 2 decades has increasingly become the stuff of jargon. Too often, creative leadership it's trumpeted by academic programs. It's used as the basis of marketing by firms and even agencies, saying, well, we practice creative leadership in a way that's different from others, and it serves as a differentiator, which in many cases becomes hollow. And so I think there's a need for the Berlin School, but also more generally as we approach creative leadership, think, okay, what does this really mean in 2021? And more importantly, what does creative leadership mean going forward for us? Many of you have met Babis Menemelis, who is an extraordinary scholar and researcher of creative leadership, who has, I think, very helpfully tracked the evolution and done meta-analyses of creative leadership in research literature going back to the 1950s. And I think that the fruits of that research are invaluable for us. That said, again, we don't want only to distill the lessons of the past related to creative leadership. We need to reboot creative leadership for the present and the future in ways that I think can be very, very productive for us all. And then lastly, and this is where I really want to begin, and it's what the series is all about, I see a potential with the idea of practice. And now, what do I mean by practice? Let me give you just 5 again, orienting ideas about practice. And these are, to some extent, different approaches to that word or a version of that word. So you can think of a practice as the application or use of an idea. And the habitual or customary application of the idea or belief is is of course an important part of this. If not every day, at least quite regular. This is related to the verb to practice, which again, we're going to unpack these further over the course of the next 6 weeks. But just to give you a sense, many of you know that I'm a believer in unpacking suitcase words, and practice is for me a suitcase word that very much benefits from our unpacking book together. But also I would propose that each of you individually would think through, what are the practices that that you in fact value. What do you privilege in your life in terms of creative work, in terms of leadership, maybe in terms of family, that you are willing to devote your time, energy, and attention to regularly, and therefore engage in a practice. Some of you may think of this idea of deliberate practice, about which much has been written. Anders Ericsson, the Swedish psychologist who was for years a professor in the US at Florida State University, sadly died last June. But he wrote from the early 90s about deliberate practice. He was the one who came up with the idea of 10,000 hours of practice, although that has been taken by Malcolm Gladwell and others. And there are debates, I think useful debates, about both the amount of time and what in fact that constitutes appropriate deliberate practice. There are debates also, for example, about what is the relationship between some sort of inherent talent and the deliberate practice. How do those combine? For the philosophers among you, you may think about the term praxis, which goes back to Aristotle. Praxis was the active counterpart to theory, and for philosophers up to the present day, this juxtaposition, I think, can be instructive for us. I actually like a more recent philosophical formulation by the great Hannah Arendt, who compared what she called the contemplative life and the active life, and she very much privileged the active life above the contemplative one, always remembering that the two are connected. And as you'll see, despite tremendous variations among philosophers, there is, again, this connection between theory, idea, and skill, and how that is applied or enacted in the world. And then the last just kind of shorthand marker or guideposts that we might open with in terms of practice is something that many of us engage in terms of religion, spirituality. Might think about this in terms of meditation or yoga, and it is our individual belief in her habitual performance of activities that are associated with whatever religious or spiritual group or program. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I think that in ways, approaching creative leadership as a practice may have most in common, at least with this shorthand description. And again, we have 6 weeks to talk about that further, but obviously there needs to be a belief in the kind of the fundamental value, both individual value and social value of creative leadership. But there also needs to be this regular, habitual, even everyday performance of activities that we see as related to that show our commitment to that individual and shared purpose. So again, I'm moving quickly here, but I just want to give you a quick preview. This is a series that's, I hope, many of you will be able to join all of the different sessions. There will be 6 of them. They'll be monthly. Look out for further communications from the Berlin School that give the specific dates and provide the links. But these are the topics that I plan to move through, and I'll give the actual date for February at the end of this presentation. But that inner game of leadership is something which those of you who may be tennis players will know. There's a classic book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which I think is a tremendous resource, and for me is a kind of touchstone for my coaching work. And the inner game of leadership is going to provide some leadership insights from coaching that I've done and especially been doing in COVID. And then you see the other topics which we will get to. So with that long preface, and again, I wanted to be sure to at least give a proper introduction to the general series. I want to move to this idea of leadership as a craft and craft work. And I should say that in approaching craft and craft work, and as some would say, craftsmen, we will update that to say craftspersons. I want to suggest again that this is very much meant to be a work in progress. So craft is an immense topic in terms of history, in terms of theory, in terms of practical examples. And so this is an incomplete overview, but it's one that I hope will, again, help to provide some of the general contours and provide some takeaways as well at the end that will be helpful to our individual creative leadership activities. So I'll just say briefly, the idea of craft was really introduced to me beyond maybe seeing craft products at a store when I was in graduate school. And I read really this fundamental work in sociology. C. Wright Mills from 1953 wrote a book called the Sociological Imagination. And the afterword to it talked about what he referred to as intellectual craftsmanship. And this is still a very important idea to me, but it's one, as you will hear in a few minutes, that I want to really push to expand. In other words, craftsmanship, it's important for Mills as a research and writing activity, as an intellectual activity. But part of our challenge as creative leaders in particular is to be sure to expand that. In other words, craft, as I will propose, needs to move beyond the register of the intellectual, needs to move beyond simply being cognitive. And so there are four different dimensions here that I want to share today. The first of these is the idea that the acts and processes of craft work have their own human value and meaning. And I'm quoting here Richard Sennett, who is I think a really extraordinary sociologist and humanistic thinker from the last half century. He also happens to be, full disclosure, he was my PhD advisor and I was his graduate assistant for 4 years. So I'm a great believer in his work and I know it well. And while he produced a book, which I'll recommend, called The Craftsman, after I had finished work with him, so much of my own thinking is shaped by the great privilege and experience I had in working with and learning from him. So just to draw out two of Sennett's insights. The first, and this is perhaps the most quoted line from his book, The Craftsman, is that craftsmanship names an enduring and basic human impulse and desire to do a job well for its own sake. Now, importantly, this does not mean that a job is done well for its own sake to the exclusion of other sakes. In other words, particularly for individuals who are leading or otherwise working in creative businesses, the point is not that one only wants to produce brilliantly executed work, regardless of what its relevance to a client's needs or the larger agencies or organizations' needs, but that there is this impulse. There is to use an imperfect synonym, but more common these days. There is a purpose to an individual who wants to do a job well because that creative execution is in itself fulfilling. And so the sense of the experience of craft, the experience of producing craft work is something that, again, I'll come back to in different ways, and these four key dimensions are overlapping, but it is an absolutely necessary place for us to start. The second point that I'll draw from Sennett's work is from his conclusion. And as you see, ultimately, what Richard Sennett wants to do is he wants to talk about craft in terms of furniture production, in terms of musical performance. He himself was formerly a concert cellist. What he wants to do is to take the lessons of how a craft provides an experience of producing physical objects, and he wants to extend the lessons of that experience to how it is that we deal with other people. And I see this as a crucial linkage to the idea of leadership as craft. Leadership, as many of you have heard me say, is about relationships. And I much prefer the word leadership to leaders. Leadership is about relationships. It's about the connections that we have with other people. And part of what Sennett is pointing to is the fact that just as making physical things grows out of collaboration and the learning that we are able to accomplish with others, so that very experience can help us to shape our dealings with others. And in terms of leadership, I see that as absolutely critical. You'll see some of the examples here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into these examples greatly, and I don't know if he's here, but I'll just mention that there's a wonderful Berlin School thesis that Nick Catliff, who many of you know, produced about craft beer production and the history of craft beer going back to, I think, the 1980s. And it's something that, in terms of both the enduring basic human impulse to do a job well, to produce great beer, but also the way in which a community of craft beer makers emerged and was really needed in terms of entering the marketplace. That's a history that Nick tracked, I think, very capably. Just quickly, those of you who know me will know that unfortunately I have a predisposition to recommending reading, so I won't dwell on these. I'll just I'll show the covers of these books. Richard Sennett's book, The Craftsman, I'd mentioned. Peter Korn's book is also worth looking at if you're interested in this. Peter Korn is a furniture maker. And this, his book is a story not just about furniture making, about his establishment of a school in the state of Maine in the United States for craft furniture makers. And so it's kind of a fascinating way not only to gain a fuller understanding of the craft of furniture making, but also the learning that is necessary for that craft to evolve and be embraced and enacted by individuals. The second dimension of leadership as craft that I want to touch on is leadership as an embodied craft practice. So somebody's making furniture, someone is playing a musical instrument. We understand the importance of embodiment. It's a little harder to understand embodiment when we're talking about leadership, especially in the age of Zoom. And I'm thankful that Stephen Taylor, he calls himself a professor of aesthetic leadership. He's at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, also here in the U.S. And you see the quote here about the importance of embodied practices to the craft of leading. And I've broken out 4 of these practices and added some additional references from the leadership literature about what that embodiment may mean. So we talk about leadership presence, for instance. We talk about being able to pay attention and perceive the context around us, whether it's a virtual one or it's a physical one. We need to engage with others, and this is very much about relational leadership. And finally, this always partly physical activity of resilience, which we're all called upon these days, where we have added physical stress, where our physical relationships have been turned upside down because of the virus. These are all ways in which we can think about leadership as an embodied craft practice. And indeed, we can think about how we can better embody these practices as aspects of our own leadership. You see the examples that I think are particularly useful. I'll call out, I'm not sure if he's here either, but many of you know Gil Coroneri, who is wonderfully creative background. He works at Apple, but he's also a longtime DJ. And he's in the process of researching what I think is also going to be a terrific Berlin School MBA thesis on DJing as craft, and that relates, I think, preliminarily in his work to questions of authenticity, to questions of learning, and so I think that again, that's very much embodied both individually and much as I mentioned in terms of Richard Sennett, it's the embodied actions of a DJ working with a crowd, and I think that becomes again, it's a powerful example when we want to think about these different practices that Taylor breaks out. You know, DJ has to be present, has to pay attention and has to very much engage with others, and also to enact resilience if the responses aren't necessarily what he or she expected. The same with actors as well, which I'll talk about in a later session. This what Diderot, the French philosopher, called the paradox of acting, which I think is relevant to leadership practice as well. And a couple of books for you. Matthew Crawford is a sociologist who wrote about craft, the craft of repairing motorcycles. It's very hands-on, object-driven routine, which requires specialized learning, tacit, hard to understand knowledge, and physical skills. And in a much more recent book, just published last year by David Goodhart, I love the title, and the title really gives away something that's critical to this discussion of craft. This is not only a cognitive exercise. Craft as an embodied practice is also a cognitive practice. It's also a question of feeling. And this word heart, I saw Marie Reg here. This is exactly what your thesis is very much about, as I understand it. This combination, though, of different aspects of ourselves, head, hand, and heart, as bases of our leadership, really allows us to lead in a more fully human way. And I think that, Goodhart's argument is ultimately that, the shift over the last 20 or 30 years toward what are known as knowledge workers has been very problematic, because part of what knowledge work, in fact, implies is that the intelligence that we need to do good work is only in our heads. So I think that this is very instructive in terms of, again, what Maria is writing about, for creative leaders in particular, needing to develop and let their hearts lead, but also figuring out how can an embodied practice of leadership join with the head and the heart. And again, David Goodhart is making that argument, I think, very compellingly. The third dimension I want to turn to is what I call the reflexive individual at the heart of the concept of craft. And I use the word reflexive here rather than reflective for a reason. Reflective practice to me is crucial. All of those of you who know me know my belief in introspection, know my belief in being reflective about our own lives, certainly about our leadership. I think, though, reflective for many has a connotation of, again, a more intellectual process. With reflexive, I want to open that out. And again, for me, being a reflexive individual underscores this regular referring back to the work of the head, the hands, and the heart. And as you'll see here, Mark Corrigan did some nice work. I can share the link with you. He was working aloud online now 8 years ago about the sociology of craft. And you'll see that he sets up a number of different oppositions that I think are useful for us. I think they're captured in one of the examples that I put below, which is handcrafted items. So we value handcrafted jewelry, for instance, or clothing, in part because it contrasts with what we see as mass-produced or machine-produced clothing or jewelry. For those of you in marketing and media fields, you know that there are recognitions. Oftentimes, there are awards given at different creative festivals for industry craft, and oftentimes this translates into excellence in execution. And I think that part of what we want to do is understand that yes, there's potentially excellence in execution, but it's never separated completely from matters of imagination. We can use the word creativity, whatever vision one has. I'll just turn to two further books here, because one of them really sets this up in a way which I don't entirely agree with, but is instructive for us. The book on the left of your screen, Leadership Craft, Leadership Art, is by Stephen Taylor, who I quoted earlier, and I think is an excellent overview of some of these topics. Iris Lavie wrote a book called Leadership Framed by Art, and again, I don't agree with it, but I think it's instructive in what I disagree with. She picks up on what many of you are familiar with as the old contrast between leaders and managers, and she associates art and the vision, the creativity, the originality of art with leadership. And then she associates the execution, the efficiency of managers with craft. Now, setting aside the point that most agencies or businesses or organizations and teams, they need both. We need to bring together good management and good leadership. We need to bring together craft and art. I think that the more general lesson here is that in many cases, particularly when it comes to leadership, we need aspects of both, or we need for different situations to determine what in fact are the kind of optimal ways to bring together elements of what we might define as craft and art in order to best serve the people that we're leading and the common ends or outcomes that we're seeking to pursue. The last dimension I want to bring up is perhaps the broadest, and I already mentioned this a bit in referencing Richard Sennett's work, where we're talking about other people, other identities. This is really the notion of how craft is the basis of certain communities not only of producers, but communities of producers and consumers together. Oftentimes, this is a community which offers an alternative to a traditional Fordist or post-Fordist marketplace. And I think that the contrast here is important because it not only gives us a broader dimension in terms of how craft plays into, say, an economic analysis that we might engage in, but you'll see the word identities, the term social identities here. And oftentimes what craft allows for producers, for consumers, is a particular social identity that allows them to position themselves both in terms of a community of craft, or call it a mainstream market community, but it also allows them to have a specific economic role and to play that economic role. An example here that I find quite instructive, and for the Berlin School is I think a regular reference point, is the Bauhaus. the Bauhaus, of course, recently celebrating its first century, was an extraordinary example of how design was meant to have. We can call it a social function, but we can also refer to Bauhaus as really having a critical community and human relations function. In other words, it's not just about production and consumption, it is about how individuals relate to each other. Think about this in terms of the kinds of furniture making or architectural design that is associated with Bauhaus or similar movements. These were designs that at a micro level desired to have people be able to interact in very human level ways, but also in a broader at a broader community level, allowed for community spaces, for public interactions. And just to give you one example, the book on the right is about how craft becomes modern, how craft, in fact, with this idea of furniture or architecture can fit into what was then a 20th century, and this book comes up to the 21st century world. In other words, how beyond having a completely separate community can we take craft objects like furniture or building design and integrate them into our world. The other book here, I'll say more about the author. Glenn Adamson, if you're at all interested in craft, is someone that I would refer you to. He's written 4 or 5 books. I particularly like this one. He's formerly the curator at the Museum of Art and Design in New York. I think he's currently a director at the Victoria and Albert in London. Very thoughtful, multidisciplinary thinker and writer about craft, who again, in terms of drawing on various traditions of craft for our own leadership practice, I think can be very instructive. So just watchful again of time. Here is a very, very brief summary, drawing together at least some of the key points on what I've tried to present in terms of my thinking about craft, and at least some of our initial touch points to help orient us. An everyday, meaningful, fully experienced work that matters for its own sake. So what does that mean in terms of what we can do? If we act on those words, if we want to take away some possible behaviors from this constellation of different ideas, we can think of everyday actions involving reshaping habits and an organization's routines. If craft and practice, for that matter, involves habit and regularity, what is it that we want to change in terms of our habits and regularity in order to develop our leadership as a craft? Meaningful, I've said a good deal about, and I think many people in this room, will understand this. But meaningful also very much for me underscores the social or collaborative dimension of craft and, of course, of leadership. Fully experienced, again, talked about fully experienced mean fully human, and acting reflexively on the engagement of the leader's head, heart, and hands. And then lastly, work that matters for its own sake. Again, this is not exclusive of other ways that creative work or craft work can matter, but there is an intrinsic enabling or intrinsic value of enabling and growing with others while pursuing shared ends. It's not just about the bottom line. It's not just about that object or that we're all working for. But in terms of leadership, if leadership is some combination of enabling relationships and building and acting within architectures, then part of what we in fact want to do is understand the intrinsic value of that enabling, and especially of the personal relationships that we as leaders engage in. So I won't go through these quickly again, because as many of you are used to, I'm slightly over time, for which my apologies. But these slides will be available and again, part of what I really want really to emphasize here is that the craft of leadership is experience-based and action-driven. It's about learning. Sennett says that ultimately craftsmen engage in the craft of experience. And I think that's right. A craft of experience needs to be a reflexive practice, needs to involve the head, heart, and hands, needs to very much live in the space between the idea, the value, the model, the brief, and the actions, the execution. And that learning is not difficult. It's not straightforward. It's not found in business cases or textbooks. And ultimately, as I get to here in the closing bullets, there's so much that's central to craft about collaboration. This is actually a point where I differ from Stephen Taylor, whom I mentioned. Stephen Taylor believes that craft has to be developed by individual leaders. I would propose to you that craft needs to be developed at the level of leadership as relationship. Again, it's social, it's communal. It is about relationships. With that, my friends, I want to close. I know I raced through that. There's a lot there, but I want again to hear some of your thoughts, your questions, your comments. I appreciate once more your being here. Throughout all my years at the Berlin School, I think I learned more from all of you than you learned from me. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions now, perhaps that Rose has been able to capture.
David, the questions are just rolling in now. So I'll take the first one here from Katja Chimmel. She's asking, David, could you give us your perspective about the difference between creative leadership and a creative leader in this analogy of craft?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I appreciate the close attention to wording, which I think is always helpful. That precision. I'll go back to my mentor's work. In The Craftsman, Richard Sennett divides the book into 3 sections: craft, the craftsman, and craft work. And I think in different ways, we need to retain those different, I would call them points of orientation. So as many of you know, if one is thinking about leadership, we can look at individual or collective leaders. We can look at leadership behaviors. We can look at leadership outcomes. And I think this in creativity, it's the same way. We can look at creative individuals, we can look at creative processes, we can look at creative environments, and again, creative outcomes or objects. For me, we can't lose track of individual creative leaders as craftsmen. And I would make that parallel because we're talking about individual figures. As I've mentioned, though, just as in the language of creative leaders versus creative leadership, I really always want to emphasize creative leadership because I see the social or communal or organizational relationships that allow creative leadership to happen as, in a way, being the first term among equals. As the first term, if I'm listing creative leadership, creative leaders, creative, you call them creative leadership outcomes or products or designs. So I think that they are related terms, but my preference is that ultimately what we want to focus on in terms of the creative leaders or creative leadership is the creative leadership as interactive activity. So with craft, yes, we need to consider ourselves as crafts persons, but I'm more interested in craft as a set of ongoing reflexive practices. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I would love to put the question like this. Is there creative leadership if the leader himself or herself is not, I mean, everybody is creative, of course, but some are more than others. So has the leader to be a very creative person if he wants to be in a framework of creative leadership?
No, it's a great
I do
question.
this question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're right to ask, and this is a much it's a fuller discussion, which is also related to the question of craft. Think, for instance, I mentioned Babis Matamelis, in his meta-analysis of creative leadership and management literature, one of the things that he identified was kind of these three different aspects or activities that creative leaders engaged in. Some were much more directive. They were creative. It was the leader's vision which drove the team or the organization forward. Other creative leaders are more facilitative, where they don't necessarily have the creativity themselves, but they know enough to assemble a creative team or organization and bring in people with the creativity that they don't have. And I think that with craft, it's the same thing. What we want to do is understand that if there is a creative outcome which is being pursued, there are a number of different ways to get at that through different forms of collaboration. And I think many of us have worked in different organizations where we have somebody who is an enabler. We have somebody who is very, very talented at fostering the creativity of others, versus, again, the opposite, where you have an immensely gifted creative leader who always has the vision, who always is able to see different approaches. Both of those can work. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. I think in more and more situations, the facilitator or the enabler is able to draw on a diversity of creative approaches, a diversity of viewpoints that in fast changing times is going to be more productive. But again, this is very, very situation and actor specific.
Okay,
David, if I can touch on what you just said. Yeah, I think that when you say creative leadership, it breaks down to two, all of the steps that you mentioned before and right now. You can think about creative leadership as leading creatives, and you can think about it as leading in a creative way. And if you're leading creatives, then your static models can work because you're just another manager. If you're leading in a creative way, I think that the alignment to your personality and your ability to be creative is critical than anything else. Because like any other creative work, that leadership needs to be creative. And by being creative, it means that it's something that you've never done before, or at the highest level, nobody has done before, because creativity by definition is something new. So for me, all of those things, when I look at the things that Sennett said and the breakdown of everyday, meaningful, fully experienced work that mattered, all of these things are actually the personality of the leader. If he is or she is a creative person or an innovator, then that leadership is creative.
Yeah.
So creative leadership.
Well, you put it better than I. Yeah, you put it better than I did, Vico. And I think that the only gloss I would add to what you've said, which I think is right, and it's been a regular tension when people ask me about the Berlin School of Creative Leadership. Okay, what do you mean by creative leadership? And of course, as you say, it's both. The only thing additionally I would add is that I think in many situations, one of the goals, or at least one of the possible goals, should be to join those two different ways of leading, particularly because I think that what you talked about as leading creatively, that's something that can be done both by individuals, but also collaboratively. So, if you have a leadership team in a larger organization, for instance, you're already drawing together individual talents or strengths. So I think that that's the only thing that I would add in terms of joining the two different perspectives that you mentioned, but I think you're absolutely right.
So
Thanks
we have a lot of questions now in the meantime, if I think we should keep it rolling. From
Please.
Caroline Kohlhoff, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. She is wondering how, I know she's a Berliner, she's wondering how important is a growth mindset in all of this?
Yes. I will start by giving you a very frustrating answer and saying that I'm going to be talking about mindsets in a future lecture. It's critical, and I think there are. By growth mindset, you're probably referring to Carol Dweck's work, although I'm actually going to pick up on Dweck and an adult education psychologist named Robert Keegan, who talks about the four or five different mindsets that adults go through. And my simple answer would be yes, it's absolutely critical. More specifically, though, as I'll describe Keegan talking about, by growth mindset, we not only are pointing to a mindset that prizes curiosity and an openness to learning and development, but for him, a growth mindset is also about engaging in a very open way with external or environmental ideas and standards and assumptions. In other words, part of what, and again, I'll explain this more in one of the future sessions, his idea is to have a growth mindset is to move beyond a mindset where we only proceed as leaders and as people with what we think is right. By having growth mindset, we need to open ourselves to others. We need to open ourselves to different ideas, theories, activities. And so you're exactly right. It's crucial. What I want to do is to step a bit beyond saying, okay, growth mindset is what we need, to explore what does that really mean and how can we more actively develop our own growth mindset and foster the development of growth mindsets in those that we're working with. But it's a great question, and that mindset is critical to both craft work and leadership itself.
Okay, wait patiently for that session about that, because I'm really interested about hearing more about that.
Carolyn, by the way, congratulations on your second edition.
Thank you.
You're moving quickly, and it's so wonderful to see, and I think it's such important work. So bravo.
Yeah, the English version is coming up next week, so stay tuned.
Wonderful.
Okay, great.
We need a copy. We have a question from Marie, who you mentioned earlier. She says, if we do not need more leadership models, which she agrees with, shall we call leadership as craft a leadership perspective, or how would you refer to it within the academic context?
I don't know. It's a great question, Marie. I think it is a perspective. It's an orientation. It's a set of touchstones or guideposts. I mean, to Vico's point, I think, again, paying attention to language, there's a problem with the word model or even framework where there's something that too often static about that. And so part of what I'm interested in here is being willing to live in a kind of dynamic space. And again, having certain touchstones or ways to orient our activities. So I think that that craft is a perspective. It's a worldview in a way. To use a phrase that comes out of a different discipline. It's a way of seeing and being in the world. Can I leave it there? Very vague, Marie?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. I'll have to work on that.
There's another one from Helena Srulovic. She says, David, how would you relate leadership, craft leadership, with the pursuit of loneliness? Is it about choosing a life of solitude?
I would say precisely not. Again, what I think it's a very good question. As I tried to emphasize, it seems to me that craft is very much a social and communal activity. It involves social experience, much as leadership is defined by collaboration and relationships. That said, loneliness, I think, is part of the equation, especially for some people. I would prefer another term here, which is the necessary time that individuals take to step away from that collaboration, from that craft for themselves, either for its practice or just as a general remove. This is something, again, I congratulated Carolyn. She's talking about introvert leaders, and I think that, again, generally speaking, introvert leaders need more of that alone time. I also think some of you may know an extraordinary book written by an extraordinary writer named Rebecca Solnit called The Field Guide to Getting Lost. And I'm a great believer that as leaders, we all need to get lost from ourselves and our habitual surroundings occasionally. It's to use a related term, we all need to unplug. While again, I wouldn't necessarily, and I don't know, maybe I'm missing the real point of your question, Helena. I wouldn't say that loneliness is the point, but we need to have alone time. We need to get lost ourselves in order to really appreciate more fully the context we're in, the relationships we're a part of, an understanding of the craft of leadership that we are pursuing. I don't think that anything that I've described is contributes to loneliness. Again, I think my hope would be that it's quite the opposite because of the emphasis on the social. Does that get at your question, Helena? I take that as a Zoom yes.
I think that's a good idea. I don't see her easily accessible, but she's free to contact us if she has further questions.
Great. Yeah.
We are out of time now, as you probably all have noticed. Unfortunately, there's still some more questions. I'm hoping people will save them up for the right occasion, especially Berliners who know they're going to see David again. And if not, I hope you'll join us for future sessions, and perhaps there'll be an occasion or you'll be inspired to ask something totally new. Do you want to go through the future?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. I just have up on screen here the date of the next session. And as I mentioned, this is about the inner game of leadership, which isn't a perfect title, but again, it jumps off of what I think is a quite extraordinary book, The Inner Game of Tennis. But this is really insights on practice from coaching. And this is both my leadership coaching, but it's also coaching across, I think, different sports and different approaches to kind of personal, professional, and life development. That will be second Thursday in February, again at 5 o'clock Berlin time. And then there are two other dates that I just wanted to share with you. The first one is next Tuesday, and that is again January 19th, also at this same hour. And this is a series. I think I announced this when I wrote to the community in December. We're calling them monthly Future Talks. And for many of them, these are, I'll have guests where we're going to talk about plans for the future of the school. Very much interested, as I said at the start of this session, in your thoughts, your concerns, your ideas about how through COVID, but especially beyond, the school and specific programs can grow and change. So please join us for that. Again, Karsten will be there, and he's been very supportive of some of the ideas that I've been working with, and I think he very much wants to get to know the community as well. The other session, and I also mentioned this, is in 2 weeks. Also on Thursday at 5 o'clock Berlin time. And this is the first of 6 sessions that my friend and colleague, Professor Doug Guthrie, will be doing. And again, he was my predecessor, so some of the older alums in the room will remember him. He's been a friend for over 20 years. He and I arrived for our first academic jobs at New York University at the same time, and since stayed in contact, and we've been working together more recently. But he's a wonderful teacher, and again, I think his insights on doing business in China, both for those who are currently doing business or want to enter the China market, will be incredibly instructive, but also doing business more generally across borders. I think that he's going to have a lot to say that's going to be helpful to you. So I would encourage you to look out for the invitation and the registration for that in 2 weeks. With that, I will just thank you all again. I know these are busy, crazy days. I know that I'm heartened to see so many familiar faces and to have this sort of discussion about creative leadership that we've had, that always invigorates me. I always learn from, and as far as I'm concerned, can only happen in this very rich way at the Berlin School. So really, thank you for being here, and I hope that you will look out for the link to the recording and also these slides if you're interested. Send me additional questions if you have those, and otherwise look forward to seeing you perhaps next week for the monthly future talks, and if not, for the second session in the series on the inner game of leadership in February. So thanks again.
Yes, I'll also say thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope you found this informative. And for those of you who aren't part of the Berliner community already, I hope that it gave you a good window into our philosophy and approach to teaching creative business leadership. We will be, of course, posting future events on LinkedIn and other social media channels, so keep following us there. I think we'll be starting a book recommendation segment in our social media as well. So keep an eye out for that, especially if you were especially inspired by some of those book titles, as I certainly was. And yeah, we hope to see you very soon.
Rose.
Yeah, sorry.
Just to interrupt you and say, as most people know, I get no royalties or percentage from recommending those books. Just so that's fully clear.
Yes, this was not sponsored by a publishing company.
Exactly, that's right.
Thank you again. Keep following us. Reach out, everyone, if you have any questions for us as well in content and marketing. We're here for you, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again.
Great.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.